Good morning and welcome to the Trinity Forum. My name is BJ Owens. I'm the Dean of Trinity Cathedral in downtown Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm so pleased to welcome the Reverend Kristine Eggert and David Eggert, who is the Executive Director and President of God Before Guns. Despite the nationwide heartache and the public outcry following the mass shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde this summer and so many others, the epidemic of gun violence continues to rage in our country. How can we as people of faith, as Christians, as people of compassion and mercy, work to end this, and even going up against cultural headwinds that can make us feel powerless? How do we listen for the voice of God amidst the thorny issue of gun violence in America, and work towards a community that honors the sanctity of life above the fears that lead us to be armed against ourselves? And I'm borrowing that very powerful phrase from you all. You're hearing your prose in that. The Reverend Kristine Eggert is the Executive Director, and David Eggert is the President of God Before Guns. Reverend Chris Eggert began her faith journey as an Episcopalian. We welcome her back. Welcome back. With her family at Christ Church Cathedral in Indianapolis, so you know something about the life of the cathedral and what the particular animal of a church that a cathedral is. It was later in midlife, while attending the Disciples of Christ congregation, that she felt a call to ordain ministry. She attended Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. She graduated with a Master's of Divinity and was ordained in the Disciples of Christ Church in 2000. Reverend Eggert served churches in Indianapolis until she was called to serve as senior pastor at Disciples Christian Church in Cleveland Heights in 2007, where she served until her retirement in 2015. She currently serves as the regional elder for Cleveland area clergy and churches, so you never quite get away from it, do you? And her gun violence activism as Executive Director of God Before Guns has brought her into many faith communities, into the State House in Columbus, and into the halls of Congress. David Eggert moved to Ohio in 2012 after retiring from careers as a public high school teacher and as a union organizer. In 2012, after two horrible school shootings in Chardon, Ohio, and Newtown, Connecticut, it galvanized his determination to do something about gun violence. So the two of them founded a nonprofit called God Before Guns, which is committed to encouraging persons of all faiths to reject the idolatry of guns and to resist a gun culture that has Americans arming themselves against one another. In the past 10 years, God Before Guns has employed a variety of approaches to raise awareness of the gun violence crisis among faith communities and in the general public in Northeast Ohio. Welcome to Trinity Cathedral, and thank you for your ongoing work. You are a part of a multi-faith coalition. Can you say just a little bit about how that came to be in the beginning and how you really began to grow momentum around this?
We organized after the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings. So our organization is about 10 years old. And though we were, and still are, Christian followers of Jesus, we recognize that the issue is universal and among all people of faith. And so it was important to us that the organization be multi-faith. And we have remained true to that throughout these 10 years.
Have you found that you have built on networks that already existed, or have you formed relationships in neighborhood and networks that didn't exist before?
Certainly, we've done both. The gun violence prevention activism side of the issue has grown tremendously over the last 10 years, and so there are organizations that are forming all the time. So, and people new to the issue coming in all the time. But also we recognize that because we do this work here in Cleveland, that there are long established neighborhood groups, community groups that have been working to end gun violence for a long time. And so we have found our way to to establish relationships with them and to recognize that they've been doing this work longer than we have and can do the work in some different ways than we can. So it's all about collaboration when you're talking about gun violence prevention.
When we first started, as you mentioned, we had just gone through 2 horrible mass shootings, in particular the one at Sandy Hook. And at our church, which was Disciples Christian Church, and Chris was the senior pastor there at the time, we started saying, what do we do? How do we respond to this? And we began to meet and to talk among ourselves at church. And then the conversation grew broader. We went to a presentation one day from Reverend Jim Atwood, a Presbyterian minister, retired, who was a member of the NRA, who had already written a book on gun violence and how it relates to people of faith in America. And at a meeting in a nearby church that where he was the presenter, we passed around a pad of paper and said, who wants to continue this conversation? And that's really sort of the beginning moment, about 10 years ago, as Chris said. And we've been, multi-denominational. Our board of directors has Jewish members, and the groups we work with include Muslim activists in Cleveland. So yes, the broad interfaith, multi-faith approach is what we've tried to pursue from the very beginning.
It is such a, maybe you've heard the term wicked problem. It is the issue of gun violence in America touches so many parts of our lives. It is rooted in so many hidden places, and not so hidden places, where it's coming from, how it manifests itself, how it warps and is difficult to tackle, because as soon as you have one angle on it, it almost changes on you. What you said about the importance of collaboration, that yes, you created this very faithful approach to gun violence. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what God Before Guns, in this constellation of folks who are really committed to changing this, to addressing it as a faith issue, as a public health crisis, as a moral crisis, as a public safety crisis, as a race crisis, all of these things. What is God Before Guns' unique niche in all of this? And then where does that thread into the work of so many of these other well-intentioned organizations towards getting towards? Is there one goal? Are there a whole bunch of little goals? Do all the goals agree with one another? Who are you, and I know who you are, but for the sake of conversation, what is God Before Guns' particular niche, and how does that thread into the greater work of gun violence prevention?
It's the perspective of faith, certainly. Not that there aren't people of faith among all the other organizations, there certainly are, but that is, we see everything through our lens of faith. And we are not anti-gun ownership, but we do, you can hear it in our name, God Before Guns. We believe that people in America are idolizing their guns. They're making idols of guns. They are respecting the Second Amendment over the First Commandment, or over the Great Commandment of loving each other and loving ourselves. So we bring that focus into everything that we do. And because we are speaking through a lens of faith, we're invited into places like Trinity Cathedral and other faith communities throughout the area where so we reach people who certainly could be reached by Moms Demand Action or the Brady Campaign or Gifford's organization, but we're reaching people through their church homes, through their communities of faith, and bringing that message that it's not the gun ownership, it's that we have lifted guns to idol status.
Right, and that's such a critical theological point, is it? I mean, to the things that we lift up to idolatry, because once it becomes an idol, it has a hold on our hearts that is beyond all logic and beyond all sense, which begins to lift up why we seem to be in a situation that is beyond all logic and beyond all sense.
It has led us to where we are now, yes.
Right. Well, since this is a faith organization, shall we do a little bit of Bible study, perhaps? Or at least exploration of, continue on these really, really important topics. I am so moved by your vision statement. I'm going to go through it, say it again. I think I said it several times in the introduction. God before guns envisions a nation in which our faith in God and each other elevates the sanctity of life above the fears that lead to a society armed against itself. And so when I started with my highlighter, I went through the whole thing and realized I was doing one word and then I had the whole thing. Because we're talking about faith in God. We're talking about elevating our faith in God. Through that, elevating the sanctity of life above fear. And Jesus says time and time again, do not be afraid. A fear that leads to a society armed against itself. That is so powerful. Can you say a little bit about how that vision statement came to be and what exactly you mean by a society that is armed against itself?
Well, thank you for reemphasizing our mission statement, and it does obviously speak to the niche that we're working to carve out, which is to speak first, but by no means exclusively to people of faith, because our outreach is also to the community at large, and much of what we do is not directed toward a faith audience. But we believe that people of faith should lead the way. And people of faith are people who we think understand the threat of fear better than most. We think people of faith understand that fear is the enemy. But we live in a society where there's an industry that uses fear to sell its products, uses crime to generate that fear. And I say uses crime because it calls upon us to be afraid of one another, to be afraid not only of the so-called criminal, but in many cases our own neighbors. And we're faced with a gun culture that seeks to flood America with guns so that our reaction will be that the only rational response is to get a gun of your own. And we seem to be slowly moving in that direction. So fear really is the enemy, and fear is something that people of faith, as you said, there's nothing that Jesus talks more about in the Gospels than fear. That is, our number one concern as human beings, and it's the number one reason why people buy guns.
We certainly have heard from the opposition over the years who will use Scripture against us, and will quote verses from Scripture and can somehow take that to mean that it's okay to be armed and to own guns. But the people who have been mentors to us and the people we have studied always take us back to the message of the gospel, the message of love. And if you want to take a Bible verse, and we know that this happens about a multitude of issues, not just gun violence, when you take a particular scripture and use it as a hammer, or
Right.
use it as an example, and then you say, but how does that fit into the greater message of the gospel, the greater message of love? What would Jesus have to say about that? Am I more like Jesus if I decide that I'm going to take that particular verse and run with it? Shane Claiborne, who is an evangelical, who works in the gun violence prevention field and also in the elimination of the death penalty. Shane Claiborne says that when Jesus told Peter to put away the sword, that early Christians, the first 300 years or so of followers of Jesus, took that to mean that was to disarm all people. And that you could die for Christ, but you could not kill in Christ's name. And that was the early message of the gospel to followers of Jesus. And obviously we've gotten so far away from that now.
Right.
I would just add, too, that in a Christian church, we're speaking of Jesus and the gospel. We could do a similar dissection of other faiths and find the same core beliefs in peace, in loving one another, and as a multi-faith organization, we want to emphasize that as Christians, of course, we find ourselves digging into our own faith, but other faiths have preached much the same message and join us in this concept that swords and guns and weapons are not part of a peaceful society. They can't be part of our communities. They can't be something that we can't live in a civilized world by arming ourselves every day.
Right. And I'm so struck by this idea of fear. To me, the question that is so much, the two questions that are in the forefront for me is how did we get here? And then how do we begin to move out of this very stuck place? Fear is such an emotional, gut level feeling. It's when we want to manipulate people, that's what not that I have a textbook for that, but that is when we've seen manipulation happening, that often it's fears that they're played on. I'm watching Ken Burns' America and the Holocaust documentary right now. Just a reminder of the mid-century. We've heard that story many, many times about how fear is used to turn people against their neighbors, against one another. And it's so dissonant with where we talk about things like a gun epidemic as a public health crisis.
Yes.
When physicians are talking about this is something that is making schools more dangerous for children, it seems perfectly reasonable and logical that we should say obviously something is amiss. But the problem is that gut level of fear. People are learning to be afraid of their neighbor and of uncertainty. And it isn't just the gun industry. I mean, if you just half of what if you see commercials, what is the message over and over? You are not safe, right? You are not safe. You need to get this product. You need to do this in order to make yourself feel safe. And getting at the deeper question for me of how we got here, do you think that there is a deeper breakdown of community that has happened over the years here in our country?
Absolutely. Gun violence is a symptom of that. The thing about gun violence, though, is that when you are selling fear, when you sell fear and it's connected with a gun is deadly.
Right.
Gun is an instrument of death. A gun its purpose is to kill, to injure and to kill. So that's what makes it so dangerous. It's not just hateful words. It's hateful words, with someone who is armed. So certainly it's part of the issue, and we are and we really do fear each other now in so many ways. The Christian nationalism and white supremacy and all these movements. I've been doing a lot of reading about that lately, and it is causing us to be afraid. And then we have a very well-funded industry that's saying, then you need to buy a gun. And if you already have a gun, you need to buy more guns.
Yes. As people of faith, how do we move beyond fear, and how do we move others beyond fear?
Well, that's what we are in our small attempts. That's what we're trying to do. And I will say that forums like this, pastors who are willing to either invite us in to speak, or who are willing to speak themselves about this issue, to say this is not about politics, even though certainly politics is part of the solution. It's going to be a political solution to some extent. But saying
anytime people gather to try to find out, discern how we live in community together, that's politics.
Yes, it is.
That's politics.
But to say that this is about the sanctity of life, this is about how we will not fear the other. This is how there isn't the other, because we are all together. We are all God's people. So certainly, and we're seeing this, we're seeing an increase in the number of faith communities and pastors who are willing to take on this issue, rather than us. We hold vigils a lot. We do a lot of vigils, especially around national events that get our attention. And we will look for a church, would you host this event? Will you allow us to come in? And what we're finding now is that faith communities are saying to us, will you partner with us? We're going to hold a vigil, and will you come? So there's a willingness now to say, I can't be quiet about this anymore. Our church can't be quiet about this anymore, because this is costing lives. And every day that we don't speak up, another 125 people, I believe now is the number every day, will die. Yes.
It's about 45,000 a year. And to return to your question of fear, of course, one of the antidotes to fear is faith, and another antidote is facts. I bring papers along because it's hard to keep up with the numbers on gun violence. But what is quite clear from the numbers, and we rely on the CDC's annual published reports on causes of injury and death in America, and it's abundantly clear that as the number of guns goes up in our state, in our nation and our state, the number of gun injuries and deaths is going up.
Yes.
Guns, the great lie from the gun industry is that guns make us safer. Guns are not making us safer. It's well established that homes with guns are places where violence is more likely. And you could start by talking about suicide. Suicide is the number one form of a gun violent death. And
something like 2 to 1.
Right, it's over 60%,
60%,
of gun deaths are suicides. And, we can talk a while about suicides, but the big difference between gun suicides and other forms of suicide is that when people try to kill themselves without using a gun, they usually fail. It's not that easy for a person to kill themselves. And so if they try to kill themselves with a method without a gun, they're probably going to survive. They're probably going to get help. And the vast majority, around 90% of those people who survive a suicide attempt, never try it again. They get help. But a similar number, about 90% of those who use a gun in an attempt to kill themselves, they kill themselves, and they never get a second chance. But again, my point is that facts are another antidote to fear. And the fact, and this is true in our state of Ohio, the fact that we keep making it easier for people to buy, for more people, more different kinds of people, and more people who may be or should be unqualified to own a gun, We make it easier for these people to buy guns. We make it easier for them to carry guns, which we did this year with legislation. We make it easier for them to take guns in more and more places. And the gun deaths in Ohio are going up. In fact, our gun death rate is going up faster than the national rate. 20 years ago, our gun death rate was significantly below the national average. About 10 years ago, we were right about at the national gun death rate, and now we're significantly above the national gun death rate. More guns are making us more endangered, not making us safer. And that's part of the way we want to address the fear that people think, you know, if I don't have a gun, I'm going to be less safe. No, the answer is if you do have a gun, you're less safe.
Are there, in the work of gun violence prevention, when we look at different types of communities in a state like Ohio, you have rural communities, you have the city of Cleveland, you have suburban communities, do you find that there is a different regard for the danger, that there is a different sense of what is at play and what, you know, where people's lives are at stake in those different kind of communities, or some communities that I'm not naming?
Well, basically, gun violence affects every community in some way. Our Ohio legislature, which because of the way the districts have been drawn, is heavily rural representation, and because there is what's the home rule, because there cannot be home rule for gun laws. A city like Cleveland cannot establish its own laws that are more strict than what the Ohio legislature has passed. So certainly among the major cities in Ohio, Cincinnati and Columbus and Cleveland and Toledo and Akron, and there are different issues facing those cities, and they are powerless right now in some ways to do anything different about it legally. Okay. We can't have a gun registration that is beyond what the state would have. And then you know, we see in Cleveland, certainly, we see young people dying by guns, most often young persons of color. And guns are so available, and they can be bought inexpensively. And then you see that here in Cleveland. Then you see in rural areas, you certainly could see a mass shooting or a school shooting or suicides. So it's, you know, I will start a presentation or a sermon by asking how many of you know someone who has been killed or injured by a gun, and no matter where I am, there's going to be more than half of the people who do know someone.
Really?
Yes.
So it's something that really touches so many of us.
It is, and if I ask that in a Cleveland high school, which I have, all hands will go up. Really? Yes.
We often, too often, think of gun violence as an urban problem, and it is an urban problem. And as Chris was saying, gun violence has for a long time been the leading cause of death for young black males. Mm-hmm. But that changed in just the last year or so, because now gun violence is the leading cause of death for young Americans of all races. Which was really? a staggering new revelation. But it's also a rural problem. People in rural areas are traditionally more comfortable with guns because guns, as you know, as a tool for hunting, have been common in rural areas, you know, since the beginning of our nation. But in rural areas, suicide is a particular problem. Guns are a leading cause of suicide deaths among white males in rural areas in particular. And in rural areas, suicide is twice as prevalent as it is in urban areas. So there are differences, but the presence of guns in a house where someone may be, whether it's a teenager or, an older white man, the presence of a gun, makes suicide much more likely. And of course, in the cities, the easy availability of guns, in fact, Chris once asked a high school class about the availability of guns, and one of the kids said,
It's easier to get than a smartphone.
Really?
Yeah.
It certainly paints a picture. When we talk about suicide among as being such a prevalent issue, talking about the feeling of human alienation that would lead someone to do that, the breakdown of community over time, the breakdown of neighborhoods, the breakdown of our trust in one another. Add to that our deepening fear of one another, and an industry that very much plays on that because the bottom line depends on that. Mm-hmm. We do begin to get a sense of where the problem lies and where it's coming from. Mm-hmm. How have you begun to see some grassroots paths forward? Where are we with that right now? What's working? What isn't working as well as we want? And let's definitely talk about Guns to Gardens.
Okay. Well, we know grassroots because we are about as grassroots as you can get. We have no paid staff. We are entirely a volunteer organization. But yes, recently, in this last year, we have become part of a movement, a national movement called Guns to Gardens. Mm-hmm. And we first experienced this in 2019, before the pandemic, where we were melting down an AR-15 at a small forge. First the gun was broken up, and then it was melted down in a small forge, and then it was repurposed into a garden tool, which might bring to mind a passage from Isaiah.
Right,
so yes.
Just a bit of one, yes.
Yes. Well, now it is a national movement called Guns to Gardens, and that was formerly an AR-15.
Was it really?
Yes.
It's an ancient tool called a mattock.
Yes.
Digging, planting tool.
Now that will never see mud. We will never dig with that tool. It's too precious to us. But Guns to Gardens had its first national Guns to Gardens Day in June, and there was a local church here in the Cleveland area who participated, and that church was Church of the Epiphany mm-hmm. in Euclid, where Reverend Rosalind Hughes is the rector. And Guns to Gardens involves generally first some sort of a gun, either a gun give back or a gun buy back. We recognize that if we're asking people to give up something of value to them, that we need to offer something in return. And so with grocery cards or gas cards, people can come and turn in a gun and receive a gun or a gas or grocery card in exchange. And then those guns are immediately chopped up, mm-hmm. and then pieces of those guns are then melted down and turned into garden tools or into pieces of art. And the event at Church of the Epiphany, I think, had over 40 guns turned in.
Did they really?
In just a 2-hour period of time. There was even a woman who had come to set up her own gun buyback right outside the parking lot. She opened up her trunk and she said she would offer more money for guns than what Church of the Epiphany was offering.
She was there to save the guns.
Yes.
Not
a person went to her, even though they could have gotten more money. The people who are turning in guns understand that those guns are going to be destroyed, that those guns will never again be able to hurt or kill anyone. At a Guns to Gardens event, there's also a prayer station. There's certainly no requirement, but after you turn in your gun, if you'd like to stop and have someone have prayer with you, you can do that. Mm-hmm. The last gun buyback that we participated in, the last Guns to Gardens, was at St. Andrew Episcopal in Mentor. And over half of the people who turned in guns also stopped at the prayer station.
Did they really?
Yes. And it's an amazing thing to see that it is a cooperation and a collaboration between gun owners and gun activists like us in a way that is helping to remove guns from homes. You know, it's one gun at a time, but it's some of it is largely symbolic, but it also is any gun that's turned in that day is never again going to hurt anyone.
Yes.
It'll never be
It'll
found
never
by
be.
a child in a home. It'll never be stolen from a home. And as you probably know, when burglars enter homes now, the first thing they look for is guns, because guns are so easy to sell. It'll never be used to threaten someone, say in a domestic violence situation.
It won't hurt a woman.
That destroyed gun will never be, available, as I say, for a child to find and possibly hurt himself, herself, or another child. And again, it won't be available as a means of suicide. So, and it's gratifying to see people bring in guns. We only pay for working guns. We'll accept guns that that are old and no longer usable. But we pay for the guns that are still functional, and we make them unfunctional as quickly as possible. But you also asked about what other areas we find for optimism, and I think one of them in particular is that we are finding more vocal, especially candidates for office, on the issue of gun violence and restrictions on guns and making America safer from gun violence. I remember when Barack Obama ran for office, he didn't talk about guns. He didn't want to talk about guns, and that was the conventional wisdom at the time. Don't go there. You may want to pass legislation if you're elected, but it's not a topic you want to get into in the election because it would offend too many people.
Right.
But that has come to an end. We are now finding candidates, a great many candidates, who are clearly going on record and saying this has to stop, enough, we've got to do something. And fortunately, for the first time this past year, we did see an actual piece of gun legislation get through Congress. It wasn't a game changer, but it was a step in the right direction. And that is encouraging, that people are finding the courage, and that's the word that Gabby Giffords uses so often. Courage.
Now, how do we begin to talk about guns in a way that I'll use the word respects rather than idolizes? Because wherever you're from in the country, you are probably either you have some awareness of firearms, or you're going to know somebody who is. I mean, I'm thinking back to a member of my previous church who was she was head of the Altar Guild, married to a firearms expert who taught gun safety. Their daughter was a markswoman, had won medals. These are folks who clearly respected and taught other people to hold in, I guess fear is a different word here, but understand that you're holding something that perhaps it can be used as a tool, but it also can be very, very dangerous. And these are not necessarily, there are different ways of understanding guns, and that don't move over into idolatry, and that's why your language is so important. When we spoke earlier, you talked a little bit about what it means to engage in conversation. Those folks for whom gun ownership is a way of life, which is a little different than idolatry, which is what we're talking about. How do you navigate that as a way of growing awareness and getting to a place where the type of suicide risk, the type of of availability, the type of alienation and community breakdown, where that becomes less of a toxic mix?
One of the ways we have done that from our very earliest days is that we produce a gun safety card.
Okay.
And we brought some that today we'll leave with you to have here on site at Trinity. But it's a card that recognizes that we know people own guns. Mm-hmm. And that we just ask that you be a responsible gun owner. Mm-hmm. So it has tips on there about how to store your gun. It also has alternatives to a gun, like carrying pepper spray or something like that. But it is a recognition of gun ownership, and that we're asking that you keep guns locked up and away from children, for example. These gun safety cards are given away at every Guns to Gardens event. We've sent them now to California, we've sent them to Massachusetts and Maine, they're all over. So that's one way. Certainly people who have become members of our organization, maybe people on our board, people at our events, are gun owners. There's no questions asked about, are you a gun owner? We expect that gun owners who have gone through background checks, mm-hmm. gun owners who are members of churches but wouldn't ever think of bringing their gun into the church on a Sunday morning. Yes, we certainly have respect for people who own guns, and respect people's right to not be in places with guns, or to be able to put up a sign that says no guns, that yes, have guns to hunt, yes, go target shoot if that's a sport that you enjoy, but keep your children safe, keep your teenagers safe.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one of the encouraging things we found, to get back to that question too, is that gun owners are not some monolithic group who all believe that, the people like us are out to get their guns. Mm-hmm. There's a ton of research that shows that gun owners strongly support some of the measures that would make America safer from gun violence, mm-hmm. such as background checks. I mean, today, to buy a new gun, you have to take a background check. It's federal law. It's been around a long time. Virtually all gun owners have taken a background check, and they would agree that, if I had to take one, so should that person. Mm-hmm. There really isn't much argument about that. For years, the NRA has preached that you should lock up your guns at home. Lock up the ammunition. In fact, they've said do it separately, 2 different places. Right. Well, we have pushed that should be a legal requirement. That you should be required to lock up your guns. It's certainly a common sense requirement, and gun owners understand that. So there really is a lot of ground that we can agree on. Most gun owners don't see any need for assault rifles to be sold to ordinary people who have no basic clue how to use them, what they're for, what to do with them. There is strong agreement on a long list of measures that could make gun violence less of a problem, less of an epidemic, less of a growing epidemic in America. And that, again, is encouraging.
Thank you. Well, there are ways forward, and thank you for naming it, and thank you for helping us to get at the root of fear. And we're going to offer a chance to ask a question. I actually need to mention, since you mentioned Rosalind, that on Sunday, December 4th from 2 to 4 p.m., there's going to be a Guns to Gardens art exhibition opening. So you'll be hearing more about that, and that will be at Church of the Epiphany in Euclid, Ohio. So so grateful for your words and for helping us to get past fear.
I know time runs short. We brought along some books by authors, all of whom we know that we would recommend. We're going to put these on a new page on our website.
Oh, good.
And anyone who wants to read more, whether it's Jim Atwood or Rosalind Hughes or some others that we didn't get to today, can find their work on our website. And that's godbeforeguns.org.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Gail. Microphone's coming your way.
Thank you for your presentation. It certainly is inspiring to hear what you're working towards. But my question is, on a more of a psychological level, are you both committed or hoping that through this work you'll be able, in a spiritual way, to change people's consciousness so that they move from this fear and violence, mindset to a more, realizing that this isn't right, because getting people to change is really hard. That's why I admire your work. And my second kind of addendum to that is, I feel, just from the reading I've done and the experiences, that the main solution is political. You have to get somehow control of, people either not being able to buy guns or more of an intense background check so that the people that are kind of the crazies don't get hold of a gun.
Thank you for that question. And I guess I would answer, because the two parts go together. We will not be able to answer the political until enough people, until culture changes enough that we can change the political. Certainly we do work with the Ohio legislature. We've been in the halls of Congress, and we write letters and make phone calls just like everybody else. But what really it needs to happen is a groundswell, and our way of doing that is through people of faith, to say that that this isn't right. This isn't the faith I have, that we have enemies and that we're armed against each other. That I follow a gospel of love, and that needs. That's why this takes so long. But culture needs to change in order for anything to change with our laws. They have to go hand in hand. But that's part of the reason why it's taking so long. That we need to abhor violence and to not support it, and to continue to spread our message of followers of Jesus. The two go together, and we won't see a big change in the numbers of people who die until culture begins evolving in that way.
A powerful way to end, but I think an appropriate one in terms of the significance of the project ahead, but also the faithful approach that we're grateful for. It's a great pleasure to have you both here. Chris and Jim Eggert are the executive director and president of God Before Guns. We're grateful for your work. We know you've been deeply involved in churches in the Diocese of Ohio and here in Cleveland, and we're so grateful you could be with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us. Thank you.
You're welcome.